Welcome, the anointed ones. The moment people stop arguing with you isn't when you're wrong. It's when they realize you're 3 steps ahead and there's no safe way to catch up. That moment is strange when it happens. The room doesn't explode. No one claps. There's no dramatic reaction. What happens instead is far more revealing. Conversations shorten, laughter fades, responses get delayed, and suddenly the loudest people in the room develop a deep appreciation for silence. Not because they're at peace, but because their mental math finally caught up and the numbers didn't look good. Here's a quiet fact most people never talk about. Studies in cognitive psychology show that when individuals encounter someone whose reasoning consistently outpaces theirs, the brain triggers a threat response similar to social defeat. It's not admiration first, it's withdrawal. The mind doesn't argue with what it can't outmaneuver. It steps back, reassesses, and often shuts up. That's not arrogance. That's biology doing damage control. And that's exactly where this story begins. Because this isn't about you suddenly proving anything. You didn't walk in announcing intelligence. You didn't flex vocabulary or dominate conversations. You did something far more unsettling. You stayed observant, calm, and precise. While others were busy performing intelligence, you were quietly connecting dots, noticing patterns, and letting people reveal their playbook without interrupting them. You weren't rushing to speak because you didn't need the room. You were mapping it. The humor in all this, the same people who once tried to explain obvious things to you like they were doing a TED Talk now need 5 business days to respond to a simple statement you made casually, probably while sipping something. The confidence they had before is gone, replaced with awkward pauses and "let me get back to you." Translation: system update in progress. What changed wasn't your intelligence. What changed was their perception. The dots finally connected. They realized you weren't lucky, quiet, or passive. You were intentional. You weren't slow. You were selective. And once that realization hit, talking became risky. Because when someone sees the board clearly, every unnecessary move becomes a liability. This is what happens when people finally recognize they're dealing with a genuine mind. Not a loud one, not a flashy one, but a dangerous to ignore one. The silence that followed wasn't respect or peace. It was recalibration. And today we're breaking down exactly why that silence happened and what it really means. Number 1. They didn't misunderstand you. They underestimated the processing speed of your mind. At first, they thought you were slow, not because you lacked intelligence, but because you didn't rush to respond. You didn't interrupt. You didn't jump into conversations trying to prove anything. In a world trained to mistake speed for intelligence, your pause was read as emptiness. They filled that silence with assumptions. They spoke over you. They simplified things around you. They thought they were ahead. What they didn't realize is that you were processing everything at once. Not just the words, but the tone behind them. Not just the situation, but the pattern forming underneath it. While they were reacting in real time, you were running simulations in your head. You were watching how people behaved when they felt confident, threatened, or careless. You weren't slow. You were thorough. This is where the shift happened. One day, without warning, you responded. Not emotionally, not dramatically, just accurately. You connected details from different moments that they didn't even remember sharing. You addressed the real issue instead of the loud one. And suddenly, the room changed. The same people who once dismissed you realized you had been present the entire time, collecting information, making sense of it quietly. That realization hits hard. It's uncomfortable to understand that someone you underestimated wasn't behind you. They were ahead, just moving differently. Your mind didn't race for attention. It waited for clarity. When they saw that your answers arrived less often but landed exactly where they needed to, their confidence cracked. Silence followed, not because you dominated the space, but because they needed time to catch up mentally. Conversations slowed. They became careful with their words. The jokes stopped landing. They weren't confused by you anymore. They were recalculating their position around you. The truth is, fast thinkers don't always speak fast. Deep thinkers don't always speak often. And when people finally realized that your quiet wasn't absence but processing power, they stopped talking carelessly. Not out of respect, but out of self-awareness. They underestimated your speed because they were measuring it by noise. And once they learned the difference, everything changed. Number 2. Your calm confused them because genius doesn't look like performance. They were waiting for you to sell it. The big words, the dramatic tone, the constant need to be seen and heard. That's what they were used to calling intelligence. So when you stayed calm, relaxed, almost unimpressed by the noise around you, they didn't register it as confidence. They read it as lack. They assumed if you really knew something, you'd rush to show it. But you didn't perform. You didn't decorate your thoughts or fight for attention. You spoke plainly when you spoke at all. You let moments pass without filling them. And that unsettled people more than arrogance ever could. Calm in a chaotic environment looks suspicious to those who survive on reaction. The truth is, performance is often compensation. People perform intelligence when they need reassurance that they still have it. They talk fast, interrupt, over-explain, and dominate the space because silence makes them nervous. You didn't share that nervousness. Your calm wasn't detachment or boredom, it was control. Over time, they started noticing something uncomfortable. When things went sideways, you didn't panic. When plans changed, you adjusted quietly. When others argued, you listened. And when you finally spoke, your words landed clean and useful, not emotional or messy. You didn't escalate situations. You resolved them. That's when the confusion set in. They couldn't place you. You didn't fit the loud smart or insecure smart categories they understood. You weren't trying to win debates or steal spotlight. You seemed more interested in outcomes than credit. That kind of calm exposes how much of their own intelligence was tied to being seen. Eventually, they realized your calm wasn't passive, it was intentional restraint. You weren't absent from the moment, you were ahead of it. You didn't need to react because you already understood where things were going. And once they saw that, their behavior shifted. People get quiet around calm intelligence because it removes their advantage. You can't compete with someone who isn't competing. You can't out-talk someone who doesn't need to talk. So the room adjusted. Voices lowered. Movements became careful. Not because you demanded authority, but because your calm made everything else look unnecessary. Number 3, you solved problems they didn't even realize were problems yet. While everyone else was busy reacting to the obvious, you were already 3 steps ahead. They were tangled in minor issues, arguing over details that didn't matter, debating solutions that missed the root. Meanwhile, you were scanning for patterns, understanding the underlying system, and identifying the cracks before they became visible. The difference is subtle but lethal. Most people deal with symptoms, but you deal with causes. That's why when you finally spoke, it landed like a bomb. You didn't offer a solution to what they were complaining about. You offered a solution to what they hadn't even recognized as a problem. That sudden clarity is jarring. People aren't used to thinking in layers that deep. They expect responses at the surface, not a blueprint for what's next. And when that happens, silence follows naturally. It's not fear or awe. It's the sudden awareness that they were behind the curve without even knowing it. What makes it even more unsettling is that you weren't showing off. You didn't dramatize your insight or highlight your foresight. You didn't need to. The results spoke for themselves. People can argue over visible mistakes, but they can't argue with solutions that anticipate unseen failures. The realization hit slowly, creeping into their mind. While they were busy playing checkers, you were playing chess. 5 moves ahead, with multiple outcomes considered and accounted for. This kind of intelligence disrupts ego quietly. They may have thought they were guiding the situation, controlling it, or influencing the outcome. You were quietly observing, mapping the landscape, and positioning yourself in ways they didn't notice. Then, without warning, the solution appears and the room stops. Conversations falter, confident assertions evaporate, and suddenly the air shifts. Solving problems that no one else sees isn't just smart. It's dangerous to the unprepared because it forces everyone around you to reassess their assumptions. They weren't just wrong, they were unaware of what they didn't know. And once they realize you've been navigating that hidden layer all along, talking becomes optional, hesitation becomes permanent, and silence becomes the default response. Number 4. They recognized you were self-taught in ways institutions can't replicate. They thought intelligence came with a degree, a title, a certificate neatly framed on a wall. That's the world they live in. Rules, curriculums, schedules, and systems that tell you what intelligence looks like. You didn't follow their blueprint, you learned differently, you observed, experimented, synthesized, and connected things that no textbook would ever mention, and that made you unpredictable in the most uncomfortable way. What really unsettled them was how naturally you handled complexity. You didn't need approval or guidance. You didn't need someone to validate your methods or confirm your conclusions. You had already internalized the process of learning, problem-solving, and adapting in a way that institutions can't teach because they can't replicate intuition, timing, and relentless curiosity. They were trained to follow, while you were trained to see the unseen. And when they finally realized this, there was a pause. The pause that comes when someone understands they are facing something organic, something that doesn't bend to schedules or hierarchies. You weren't regurgitating knowledge, you weren't showing off polished phrases or rehearsed ideas. You were presenting results that were accurate, layered, and fast, results that weren't teachable, only lived. It's terrifying for them because self-taught intelligence doesn't play by the rules. It can't be negotiated with. It can't be measured by exams, accolades, or titles. You can't intimidate it, and you can't catch it off guard with bureaucratic logic. It moves on its own axis. That freedom of thought, combined with precision, forced them to step back. Suddenly, they were the ones recalibrating. They couldn't dismiss you, and they couldn't compete with you using the tools they understood. The realization hit slowly. The person they underestimated was never limited by their frameworks, never confined by their expectations. You weren't just smart, you were a whole system operating outside their control. And that understanding didn't earn you applause. It earned silence because they were busy trying to figure out how to process a mind that couldn't be replicated, contained, or tamed. Number 5. You weren't reacting to them. You were observing them. They thought they were influencing you, shaping your reactions and controlling the conversation. They assumed that every pause, every smile, every nod was a signal they could read, a weakness they could exploit. What they didn't know is that while they were busy performing, you were watching. Every word, every gesture, every inconsistency was being catalogued, analyzed, and stored. You weren't engaged in their game, they were engaged in yours without realizing it. Observation is a different kind of power. It doesn't demand attention, it doesn't make noise. It quietly collects information that becomes ammunition later. You were noticing patterns in behavior, the tiny ways people try to assert authority, and the blind spots they rely on to feel secure. By the time they realized how much you understood, you had already anticipated their next moves. You didn't need to challenge them directly. because your awareness made their actions irrelevant. That's why the silence hit so hard. When they finally noticed you weren't reacting, it wasn't because you were indifferent, it was because you were several steps ahead. You were always calm because you already knew where things were going. You weren't distracted by ego or emotion, so their attempts to provoke, impress, or confuse you fell flat. Their energy, their intensity, and their assumptions became visible to everyone else in a way that exposed their own insecurities. Observation creates an invisible leverage. They realized too late that they had been performing on a stage you designed without touching a single prop. You weren't aggressive. You weren't manipulative. You simply understood more, and your understanding changed the entire dynamic. When they finally connected the dots, they didn't respond immediately. Silence became their only safe option, because acknowledging your insight meant admitting they had been outmaneuvered without a fight. Being observed in this way is uncomfortable because it removes the illusion of control. You were never reactive. You were omnipresent, calculating, and precise. And that quiet mastery doesn't need words to dominate a room. It doesn't ask for recognition. It leaves people staring, speechless, and quietly recalibrating, realizing that they've been playing catch-up the entire time without even knowing it. Number 6. Your restraint revealed discipline, not fear. They assumed you were holding back because you didn't react the way they expected. They thought silence meant hesitation or weakness, and they tested it, pushing boundaries, dropping challenges, trying to provoke an overreaction. What they didn't understand is that every pause, every measured response, every quiet moment was intentional. You weren't passive, you were disciplined. You weren't controlling your words because you were afraid. You were controlling them because you understood the weight of action and the cost of misstep. Restraint is often mistaken for submission, but it's the opposite. It's power concentrated, contained, and ready. While they were performing, reacting, and burning energy on proving points, you were conserving yours, waiting for the exact right moment to act or speak. And when you did, it landed precisely where it mattered. That's why their confidence faltered. They thought the space was theirs to dominate, only to realize they had been playing into your timing all along. Your discipline made them uncomfortable because it exposed how little control they actually had. People like to operate under the illusion that noise and movement equal influence, but restraint reveals the truth. Influence comes from understanding, patience, and precision. Your calm wasn't absence, it was preparation. Your silence wasn't ignorance, it was calculation. And when they finally saw the results of your restraint, the shock didn't come from what you did say. It came from what you didn't say until it was most effective. That's when they went silent. The room changed. They became cautious, measured, and hesitant because your restraint rewrote the rules of interaction. Discipline makes the loudest people self-conscious. They realize that their attempts to dominate or unsettle you are meaningless. They notice the clarity and control in your actions, and they understand, without a word, that restraint isn't a lack of power. It's the purest form of it. You weren't reacting to them. You were proving, with every quiet move, that mastery doesn't need to be announced. It simply exists. And when that truth hits, silence is the only safe response. Number 7. You made complexity feel simple, and that threatened their identity. They built their confidence on appearing smart. Every conversation was a performance, a way to prove their worth, and every detail they emphasized was carefully chosen to show competence. That's why when you took a tangled problem, broke it down effortlessly, and explained it clearly without drama, their sense of superiority cracked. It wasn't just that you solved the issue, it was that you made them feel unnecessary in a space they thought they controlled. Simplicity from intelligence is more unsettling than confusion, because it exposes insecurity without even raising your voice. You didn't overcomplicate things to impress anyone. You didn't need the approval of the loudest voices in the room. You just saw the patterns, understood the systems, and communicated solutions in a way that cut straight through layers of unnecessary noise. That clarity was sharp. It revealed where people were struggling, not because they lacked effort or education, but because they had built their identity on complexity itself. Some people confuse struggle with skill, and when you show that a solution can be elegant, fast, and accurate, it undermines everything they believed about themselves. The threat isn't to their intellect, it's to their ego, their self-perception, and their place in the hierarchy they've relied on for confidence. They notice the gap immediately. The room shifts. Comments falter, jokes land awkwardly. Suddenly, the energy they were counting on to dominate is gone, replaced by silent reassessment. You don't need to prove superiority. The act of simplifying complexity does it for you. They start to realize that they've been playing checkers in a game of chess. Their systems, their carefully constructed arguments, their attempts to appear capable, all of it looks fragile in contrast to your effortless clarity. They may try to argue, to complicate, to reclaim authority, but deep down, they know it's useless. The identity they built around appearing smart cannot compete with the quiet power of someone who understands without struggle. And that's why silence follows. Not fear, not awe. Simple recognition that someone else operates on a level where complexity bows down, leaving them to process, adjust, and quietly recalibrate without ever saying a word. Number 8. They realized you weren't competing. You were operating on a different axis. They thought they could measure you the way they measure everyone else, using the same rules, the same metrics, the same ego-driven benchmarks. They assumed every move you made was meant to be compared, challenged, or countered. They assumed you were playing the same game, under the same terms, striving for the same recognition. And then, suddenly, they realized the truth. You weren't competing at all. You were operating on a completely different axis, one they couldn't even plot on their mental map. That realization is disorienting. People are used to interacting with intelligence in ways they understand. Verbal sparring, debate, performance, visible problem-solving. They can track that. They can strategize against it. But when someone exists outside the expected parameters, it breaks the framework they rely on. Your moves weren't about winning arguments or claiming superiority. They were about understanding systems, observing patterns, and making precise, calculated choices that made their strategies irrelevant. The power of not competing is invisible until it lands. You didn't try to dominate the room or assert control. You didn't respond to provocations. You didn't need validation or applause. And that's exactly what threw them off. They were used to everyone else fighting on the same plane, reacting in predictable ways, and now there was a presence they couldn't manipulate, anticipate, or outmaneuver. They had to pause, adjust, and consider their position, not because you forced them to, but because your clarity made their games meaningless. Operating on a different axis isn't just intelligence, it's freedom. It's immunity to the petty dynamics that control most interactions. When people finally see it, the silence is immediate. There's no argument, no outburst, no attempt to reclaim control, because they recognize that you aren't on the field they're playing. You've already moved sideways, beyond their influence. The shock isn't in your actions. It's in their realization that the rules they live by don't apply to you. That insight doesn't just earn quiet respect. It forces hesitation, recalibration, and ultimately, silence. They aren't ignoring you. They are acknowledging that competing is irrelevant. You exist in a dimension of thought and strategy they can see, but cannot touch. And that truth changes the room entirely. Number 9. You didn't seek validation, which exposed their dependency on it. They spent so much time trying to impress, to dominate, to secure approval, that they assumed everyone else was playing the same game. They thought recognition, applause, or agreement was the currency of intelligence and influence. They didn't realize that you weren't interested in any of that. You didn't need nods, claps, or validation to confirm your understanding or your worth. You operated independently of their metrics, and that made them uncomfortable in ways they couldn't name. When someone doesn't seek validation, it exposes a truth most people avoid. Their confidence is fragile. They realize their authority, influence, and self-perception are built on external reinforcement. And when you show up calm, accurate, and unaffected by their attempts to manipulate or impress you, their whole framework collapses silently. They can no longer rely on the reactions of others to feel secure, because the one person who doesn't respond the way they expect is already operating from a different plane. That silence that follows isn't admiration. It's panic disguised as pause. It's the sudden awareness that their ego, which has guided so much of their behavior, doesn't apply here. You didn't need to convince anyone of your intelligence. You didn't need to prove yourself. And that lack of dependence highlighted their own dependency. Your independence made them reevaluate every interaction, every assertion, every attempt to assert control. It forced them into a position of caution they weren't used to. By not seeking validation, you also reclaimed control over the narrative. You weren't bound by perception, approval, or expectation. Your actions, your words, your insight carried weight because of their accuracy and impact, not because they were recognized or praised. People who once tried to dominate or influence you now found themselves pausing, analyzing, and recalibrating quietly. The reality is stark. When someone operates free from the need for validation, it unmasks those who depend on it. Your self-sufficiency isn't arrogance, it's power. And when people finally see that you don't require their approval, they don't respond with noise. They respond with silence, because their usual tools no longer work, and that moment of realization is uncomfortably revealing. Number 10. Your questions disrupted narratives they were invested in protecting. They built their world on stories, small truths dressed as certainty, assumptions dressed as expertise, and opinions dressed as facts. Those narratives weren't random. They were carefully constructed to make them feel in control, intelligent, and untouchable. They thrived in environments where no one challenged the scripts they depended on. And then you arrived, asking questions that weren't confrontational, but precise enough to pull at threads they didn't want anyone to notice. Your questions weren't designed to attack. They weren't loud, aggressive, or performative. They were surgical. One carefully placed observation, one unexpected inquiry, and suddenly the foundation they were standing on began to wobble. People get defensive when their stories are questioned because those stories aren't just narratives, they're identity. When someone exposes gaps without drama, the response is almost always silence. It's not that they're intimidated, it's that their mental armor is cracking and they don't know where to start patching it. What made it more disorienting is that your questions highlighted patterns they had overlooked. They noticed connections they didn't want to see, contradictions they had been ignoring, and inconsistencies they had rationalized. You weren't telling them they were wrong. You were showing them that their narrative was incomplete, unstable, and far less reliable than they believed. That subtle exposure is terrifying because it doesn't invite debate. It forces reflection. And reflection doesn't always have a quick answer. Once they realized what was happening, the energy in the room shifted. Conversations stalled. Confidence faltered. They became cautious with every word because every statement now risked revealing more of the cracks in their narrative. They understood, sometimes unconsciously, that continuing their usual behavior could expose them further. silence became the natural response, a shield against their own unraveling. You didn't break them with noise or force. You did it with clarity and precision. The questions weren't the weapon, the awareness they triggered was. By challenging the narratives people rely on, you force them to confront truths they weren't ready to face. And in that confrontation, they found there was no safe way to respond, so silence became the only option, loud in its implication. Number 11. They understood your intelligence was inconvenient, not decorative. Most people expect brilliance to be ornamental. They imagine it as something that complements their environment, something to admire from a distance like a trophy or a polished accessory. That's the kind of intelligence they're comfortable with, visible, impressive, and harmless. What they didn't expect from you is that your intelligence isn't meant to decorate the room. It's functional, relentless, and refuses to compromise. It exposes inefficiency, misjudgment, and weakness. It doesn't flatter, it challenges. And that makes it dangerous to anyone who depends on illusion rather than substance. They were caught off guard because they thought intelligence meant talking fast, flaunting credentials, or performing cleverness for approval. Your approach wasn't performative. You didn't make people feel small to appear big. You made them see the reality of situations they were ignoring. You pointed out gaps they weren't ready to address. You solved problems they didn't even know existed. That kind of clarity isn't comfortable. It's inconvenient. It forces people to confront their own mistakes, habits, and blind spots without the soft cushioning of ego or ceremony. The discomfort is silent, but electric. You could see it in pauses, hesitant corrections, and the way energy shifted in the room. They weren't silent out of admiration. They were silent because acknowledging your mind would force them to act, to change, to admit that they had been behind all along. That realization isn't easy to process. It's unsettling to witness someone operate in a space where their assumptions, shortcuts, and performances no longer matter. Your intelligence doesn't ask for applause. It doesn't need validation. It demands alignment with truth. That truth is inconvenient. It unsettles, disrupts, and exposes the weaknesses people hope remain hidden. They finally understood that they couldn't manipulate, ignore, or negotiate with you. They had to pause, recalibrate, and process what they were seeing. Silence became the only safe response. It wasn't reverence, it was an admission that they had underestimated what operating without compromise looks like. Your intelligence isn't decoration, it's action. And that distinction leaves people speechless, quietly adjusting to the reality they hadn't seen coming. Number 12. You noticed what everyone else ignored, and named it without drama. Most people navigate life skimming the surface, reacting to what's obvious and avoiding what's uncomfortable. They focus on the visible, the loud, the dramatic, and ignore the subtle truths that actually dictate outcomes. You, on the other hand, don't skim. You see the hidden currents, the small details, the inconsistencies that everyone else pretends aren't there. You notice what is inconvenient, what others avoid naming, and you articulate it with clarity, precision, and zero theatrics. That combination is disarming. It forces people to confront realities they have been conveniently ignoring without giving them the satisfaction of drama. Naming truths without fanfare is disruptive because it strips away layers of pretense. When you identify a problem, a contradiction, or a hidden pattern, you don't embellish it. You don't dramatize it. You present it as fact, plain and undeniable. That approach makes people uncomfortable because it removes their ability to respond with noise, jokes, or distraction. They can't argue with subtlety. They can't hide behind emotion. They can't redirect the conversation. The spotlight isn't harsh, it's precise, and it exposes the blind spots they've been relying on. What makes this even more powerful is that it forces reflection without aggression. People don't immediately lash out because there's nothing to fight. They pause. They adjust. They reevaluate their assumptions, their strategies, their positions. And that pause can feel deafening. Silence isn't empty. It's the mental machinery turning, recalculating what was ignored until now. You didn't create tension to assert superiority. You created clarity to reveal reality. The same people who thought they understood the environment, who assumed they were in control, suddenly realize that someone else sees all the hidden layers. They may smile, nod, or even continue the conversation as if nothing happened. But internally, they are reorganizing. They are processing that you have insight they cannot dismiss, and that awareness silences them. By noticing what everyone else ignored and stating it plainly, you establish authority without theatrics, dominance without force. Your clarity is undeniable, and your restraint magnifies its impact. People can't compete with it. They can only absorb it, recalibrate, and respect the quiet power of someone who speaks truth without performing it. Number 13. They understood you couldn't be manipulated once the dots connected. People try to control others the way they control narratives, through pressure, influence, or subtle manipulation. They assume everyone reacts predictably, that vulnerabilities are universal, and that charm, argument, or fear can bend people to their will. They didn't account for you. By the time they realized the dots were connected, any attempt to manipulate you had already failed silently. They saw, often too late, that their usual tactics had no effect. You weren't resistant, you were untouchable, because you already understood the framework of their intentions, the patterns in their behavior, and the consequences of their moves. Once someone realizes you can't be manipulated, the energy in a room shifts instantly. They no longer feel in control, and control is what most people cling to like oxygen. They try to recover by talking more, pressing harder, or asserting authority, but it's too late. You aren't reacting emotionally or predictably. You aren't engaging in the tug-of-war they expected. The air grows heavy with realization. They've been attempting influence against someone who has already mapped the entire system. The beauty of this understanding is in its silence. You don't need to call it out. You don't need to prove it with words or actions. The mere awareness of their failure to influence you is enough to alter the dynamic. Suddenly, hesitation replaces confidence, calculated moves replace impulsive ones, and they speak less, because every word risks exposure. Silence becomes their shield. Your inability to be manipulated isn't about stubbornness or ego. It's about awareness. You see the structure, you see the motives, and you see the end game before they even recognize it themselves. That clarity dismantles their leverage, and leverage is all they had. When the dots connect and people realize they can't bend you, the room falls quiet. It's a quiet born not of fear, but of recalibration, a recognition that you exist outside their influence. They were playing a game they didn't know you understood fully, and by the time they realized it, it was too late to change anything. Their silence is the echo of a power shift they cannot articulate. Number 14. They went silent because acknowledging your genius would force self-reflection. There's a moment when people finally connect the dots, when the realization hits that they've been underestimating someone all along. That moment isn't easy for them, because it demands a confrontation they weren't prepared for, with themselves. Your intelligence, your calm, your precision, it doesn't just exist in isolation. It reflects everything they've ignored, misjudged, or failed to see. To recognize your genius is to admit their own mistakes, their oversight, their assumptions, and that truth is uncomfortable. Silence becomes the natural reaction, because speaking would force them to confront a reality they've been avoiding. Acknowledging someone else's brilliance challenges ego. It forces them to ask, where did I go wrong? Why didn't I see this before? How could I have misjudged someone so completely? Those aren't easy questions to answer out loud. They don't fit into casual conversation. They don't come with applause or reassurance. Your presence alone, precise and unshaken, highlights gaps in their perception and understanding, and people instinctively retreat rather than face that discomfort. Their silence is heavy, but it's not emptiness. It's recalibration. Every word they might have said now risks exposing their own blindness, their missed calculations, their overconfidence. They were loud when they assumed parity. Now they are quiet because parity doesn't exist. They aren't just realizing your skill, they are realizing the cost of having underestimated it. The truth is, your genius doesn't demand recognition. It operates quietly, effectively, and relentlessly. It forces people to confront themselves without a single raised voice. When the dots connect, it's jarring. People are left alone with the realization that they misjudged someone whose intellect moves on a level they can barely comprehend. And in that space, silence becomes safer than speech. They go quiet, not because they respect you. They go quiet because recognizing you fully would demand they confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. That is the power of a mind that operates independently, deliberately, and with clarity. Your brilliance forces reflection, and reflection is rarely easy. Silence, in this case, speaks louder than any word ever could. When you step back and look at it all, it becomes clear why the silence happens. It's not random, it's not fear, and it's not respect. It's the natural response of people who realize too late that they were measuring you by their standards, trying to predict you with their tools, and controlling you with assumptions that never applied. Every pause, every delayed reaction, every hesitant word is a reflection of them recalibrating, trying to make sense of someone who operates beyond their comprehension. You weren't loud, flashy, or aggressive. You were precise, observant, disciplined, and intentional. Your calm revealed more power than their noise ever could. Your questions exposed truths they weren't ready to admit. Your understanding solved problems they didn't even know existed. You weren't competing. You weren't performing. You were simply being, and in being, you forced them to confront realities about themselves, their systems, and their limitations. The moment they went silent wasn't admiration. It was realization. It was that jarring awareness that they underestimated someone who didn't need validation, someone who didn't need to react, someone who was already operating on a higher plane. They saw clarity, self-sufficiency, and discipline in action, and it made their noise irrelevant. They saw intelligence that didn't need performance, solutions that didn't need explanation, and precision that didn't need applause. Every assumption they had about you crumbled, and there was nothing left to say. Silence became their shield, their pause, their way of processing the fact that they had been behind all along without even noticing. And that is the power of a mind that refuses to be ordinary, predictable, or contained. That is what makes people pause. That is what makes people reconsider. That is what leaves them speechless. Every subtle observation, every calculated pause, every act of clarity becomes louder than any argument, any rebuttal, or any attempt to manipulate. You don't just move through the room, you change the room. And that is the reason the silence exists, because you are operating on a level most people cannot comprehend, and their recalibration cannot be rushed. If this resonated with you, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss insights like this. Like this video if you feel the power of understanding what real intelligence and clarity can do. Comment below and share your experiences with moments when people underestimated you and went silent. And most importantly, share this with someone who needs to see the truth about influence, observation, and untouchable minds. This isn't just a video. It's a map for understanding what happens when brilliance meets unprepared minds. Don't miss out. God bless you.